Question number 25 on the reading portion of College Board's Test 4. What does the author suggest? So suggest means that he doesn't say it outright, but he's heavily implying it. You know, he's kind of leading you to believe that next step. What does the author suggest about the transgenic studies done in the 1980s and 90s? So we need to answer a very particular question here. We care only about the 80s and 90s, and what does the author suggest about the studies done at that time? Realize that 26 is the quotes that support 25, so we're going to have to answer these two questions together. But let's see if we can narrow down answer choices for 25 first. Again, just to be very clear, we are answering a very particular question, 1980s and 1990s about studies. What does the author think about these studies done in the 80s and 90s? Well, I remember the piece talks about the 80s and 90s, line 31. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, studies provided proof of principle, as scientists created transgenic mice, sheep, goats, pigs, cattle, and rabbits that did in fact make therapeutic compounds. At first, this work was merely gee whiz scientific geekery, lab-bound thought experiments come true. That's, I guess, what the 80s and 90s offered. That they were able to show proof of principle, that they were able to show the concept works. That through creating transgenic mice, sheep, goats, pigs, they were able to make therapeutic compounds in the milk. But what was the deal about these experiments? These were just proof of principle. It was just, yeah, okay, you can do it, but can you make it on a large scale? Can you produce it for the needs of the marketplace? And I think that's what the question's probably targeting. That the 80s, transgenic studies in the 80s and 90s, it was the first time we were able to show proof of principle, that we can show that this thing works. But at first, it was thought of just as mere gee whiz scientific geekery, lab-bound thought experiments, like, oh, look, we can make this thing. That all changed with A-Train. So what does the author suggest about these studies in the 80s and 90s? They were limited by the expensive nature of the research. We never once talk about expensive nature of the research. It might be true that the research is expensive. However, do they ever once bring up that these experiments were expensive? Never. We never say that. Can't be A. What about B? They were not expected to yield products ready for human use. Maybe. This is a very confusing answer. They are trying to make this answer look as wrong as possible by making it as confusing and as scary as possible. The studies were not expected to yield products ready for human use because what did we find out? They were gee whiz scientific geekery, lab-bound thought experiments come true, line 35, 36. At first, they just thought that it was a proof of principle. But in no way did they ever think that we could use this for human use. But that all changed with Atrin. Atrin is an antithrombin that can be used to prevent life-threatening blood clots. So that was the difference maker. That was the shift. This was the fulcrum of the entire piece. Before, line 36, it was all just scientific experiments in labs. But after line 36, that all changed with Atrin, and then we go and talk about Atrin. So this transition from line 35 to 40 is the most important transition of the whole piece, mind you. So pick up on that, by the way, as an aside with science passages, pick up on where the central shift occurs, when the big event happens, when the breakthrough occurs, because there are definitely going to be questions surrounding that in the questions after the passage. So they were not expected to yield products ready for humans. This is a really good, easy answer for you to cross off, by the way, like if you're not paying attention, because you kind of get scared of the wording, you don't understand exactly what it's saying, you're like, screw it, and you get rid of it. Realize, though, that you can't get rid of answer choices just because they make you uncomfortable or because they make you feel bad. If you don't understand what it says and you feel uncomfortable about it, leave it alone. Deal with it later. Get rid of answer choices you know to be wrong. What about C? Transgenic studies in the 80s and 90s were completed when an anticoagulant compound was identified. That's like a weird logical, that's like they're trying to mix up the timeline, I think, here. They're trying to mislead you because it says they were completed when an anticoagulant compound was like the studies in the 80s and 90s were completed when they were able to identify an anticoagulant. That was like okay guys, let's pack it up, we're done. We found the anticoagulant. No, the anticoagulant was just the first one to be mass produced. This was not, the logic of this was not, oh, we found the anticoagulant compound, let's pack it up, we're done. No. They were completed when an anticoagulant was identified. That was not true. The experiments were not completed when an anticoagulant was found. D, they focused only on the molecular properties of cows, goats, and sheep. I don't like only answers. It bothers me. You have to be very careful about answer choices that say only, always, never. they focused only, so the 80s, 90s only focused on cows, goats, and sheep. Well, not true, because we talked about mice, sheep, goats, pigs, cattle, and rabbits in the 1980s and 90s. So notice on how this is just a way for them to see if you remember cows, goats, and sheep and be like, oh, I remember that. Let me pick that. That seems comfortable, especially when you get down with the slog of confusion with A, B, and C for the answer choices. And you get down to D, you're like, oh, this seems reasonable. Let me settle for D. Never settle. Never. So it's not going to be D. I think the answer is going to be B, but we're going to have to take a look at the quotes in order to verify that. This is a very hard question, so following me through my logic as we go through this is, in my opinion, very valuable to avoid making this mistake on the real test. So let's take a look at 26. Question number 26 on the reading portion of College Board's Test 4. Which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? So the previous question was, what does the author suggest about transgenic studies done in the 80s and 90s? And we think they were not expected to yield products ready for human use. I highly recommend, if you didn't watch the video for 25, to watch that, because we realize A, C, and D all fall short, and B is the only one that kind of makes sense when we talk about the 80s and 90s, this period right before we're able to produce Atrin, which came out in line 71, 2006. So we think the answer is B for 25, but let's assume that we can't see these answer choices, A, B, C, D for 25. Let's just answer the question being asked in 25 and find a quote that supports it in 26. So what does the author suggest about the transgenic studies done in the 1980s and 90s? Line 16 to 19. Does this talk about the 80s and 90s and their studies? The trouble is that it's difficult and expensive to make these compounds on an industrial scale. And as a result, patients can face shortages of the medicines they need. This has nothing to do with the 80s and 90s. This has to just do with the anticoagulant being difficult to produce before the farming came into effect. What about B? Does B talk about transgenic studies done in the 80s and 90s? 25 to 29. Just for context, in the 1980s, gave scientists an idea. So this is only the 80s. That bothers me a little bit. If they put the gene in just the right place under the control of the right molecular switch, maybe they could engineer animals that produce healing human proteins. But what do we know in the 80s and 90s? We found proof of principle. In the 80s and 90s, we were able to make transgenic animals that made therapeutic compounds in milk. So this is not, in the 80s it gave scientists an idea, but this is not talking about the 80s and 90s, which showed that we could actually do it. Not a fan. Not a fan of B either. What about C? Line 35, 36. At first, this work was merely gee whiz scientific geekery, lab-bound thought experiments come true. So at first, this work was gee whiz scientific geekery. And this is referencing the 80s and 90s. So I like on how this is the answer that's closest to the 80s and 90s when we talk about these studies provided proof of principle. But this proof of principle in a lab, just showing that it merely could be true, was thought of at the time as merely gee whiz scientific geekery, lab-bound thought experiments come true. It was just, pie in the sky. Yeah, great, you're able to make it in a lab, but can you make it for millions of people? Well, what's the shift going to be? That all changed. So people in the 80s and 90s thought that this was not able to produce therapeutic compounds for the larger market. So they were not expected to yield products ready for human use because they thought in the 80s and 90s that studies done on transgenic animals were just pie in the sky scientific geekery. So I really like C for 26 because it matches up nicely with B for 25. But let's take a look at D and see if this answers anything about transgenic studies in the 80s and 90s. That all changed with Atrin, a drug produced by the Massachusetts firm GTC Biotherapeutics. Atrin is an antithrombin. So besides the fact that Atrin came out in 2006, I can understand why this is a very tempting answer choice, but realize, what is this saying? What is quote 37 to 40 saying? Atrin was produced and it was the first of its kind. What does that match up with for ABCD for 25? Does that talk about limited by the expensive nature of the animal research? No. Not expected to yield products ready for human use. If anything, this shows us that it was able to be made by humans. They were completed when anticoagulant compound. The answer for D in 26 is going to match up with 25C. So let's understand why that's wrong. They were completed when an anticoagulant compound was identified. The studies of the 80s and 90s were not completed when we found out that we can make an anticoagulant in the blood. because that is furthermore not talking about the studies done in the 80s and 90s. It's not. It's talking about in 2006 when we were able to make this drug. So we only care about the 80s and 90s. And we found that it was a proof of principle, that we can make it, yet it wasn't really able to be mass marketed. That's why this quote 35 to 36 makes a lot of sense, because it was just, gee whiz, scientific geekery, lab-bound thought experiments come true. So the transgenic studies of the 80s and 90s were not just completed when the compound was identified. That's a weird, oh, now we're done, we found it, we solved the problem. No, this is just one thing that came out, and furthermore, it didn't come out in the 80s and 90s. The answer to number 25 is going to be B, and that really nicely matches up to the answer to 26, which is going to be C. C talks about it being lab-bound thought experiments. It wasn't really thought to produce anything for human use. It was just a proof of principle that they were able to do it. This was a tough question. I understand if you picked D for 26, and I understand if you picked C for 25. But realize that's not what was happening in the 80s and 90s, and that's not what the author suggests about the studies in the 80s and 90s. Again, Atrin came out in 2006, but the author's not even suggesting that it was completed. He never says, and then we were done, then we finished the field because like we cracked the code. No, this is just the first of many instances of being able to use transgenic animals to create compounds in blood or in milk for human consumption. So the answer, again, to number 25 is B, 26 C. Very hard question.